Would you mentally pull up a time in your life when something major came up seemingly out of the blue? And like a tsunami or earthquake, it quickly engulfed your thoughts, your emotions, rocked your world, overwhelmed you to the point where not only do you not know why it's happened or how it's going to turn out, but initially there's no way that you could see God in it. Oh, you know that preachers always say He's in control. And you've heard me for a number of years quote Romans 8:28 that in all things God works, but in the midst of what you have unexpectedly been forced to deal with, it seems like that God is a million miles away, and there's no way that what the psalmist wrote is true, that He's an ever-present help in trouble. When the psalmist wrote that in Psalms 46, he said his world was rocked by an earthquake-like scenario, and the mountains were shaking and almost crumbling. And in the midst of that scenario, he wrote these words, "Be still and know that I'm God." And we know we've been told to do that. But it's still hard to really believe the very next verse, which is the end of that psalm that says, "The Lord Almighty is with us." Take that scenario you've pulled up in your mind and hold on to it for a moment. We'll come back to it as we continue our study through the Bible. Looking for God and looking for God at work. Our monthly Bible reading at home has brought us today to the book of Esther, which is a fascinating Bible book. So let's open our Bibles there together this morning. Even though this is one of the 66 books that made it into the canon of the Bible, the book of Esther does not mention the name of God. It has no prophecy about Jesus. It makes no mention of worship. It does not mention heaven or many other great biblical subjects. Then why is this book in the Bible? One writer said, "When our enemies are on our heels, seldom are our Red Seas parted. When disaster's at our door, seldom are we warned by angelic visitors. When we're in need of direction, seldom are we instructed by God from a burning bush." But neither was Esther. It's easy to see God in the obvious. It's not easy to see Him in the mundane. But that's where most of us live. Without seeing the handwriting on the wall or hearing the thunder at Sinai, we live with God, and most of the time He's not out front and on center stage, but rather He's behind the curtain directing the story from behind the scenes. Can you relate to that? I believe there's truth. To understand this story, let me quickly share with you the 5 main characters that can't see what God's doing, much less that He is using them. But make no mistake about it, God is at work. The book of Esther is a story of a kingdom and a powerful but clueless Persian king named Xerxes in verse 1. Some translation calls him Ahasuerus, which was a title like Pharaoh or Caesar. 103 years after King Nebuchadnezzar had taken the Jews into Babylon, and 54 years after God had worked through Zerubbabel to bring the first group of Jewish exiles back to Jerusalem, and 25 years before Ezra brings that second group back to Jerusalem, the story occurs in Persia, which is in the present-day country of Iraq. This Persian king reigned over 127 provinces. The Bible said he ruled an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. He is powerful. He is extremely wealthy. He is worldly and self-centered. He's a man who can be easily manipulated and doesn't think much for himself. It's also a story not only of a king and a kingdom, but a story of two queens. One of them was Vashti. She was everything this king wasn't. She was a lady who would not compromise her dignity or her moral boundaries, regardless of the tremendous pressures that's put upon her. Then there's the next queen that follows her. The one who this book is named for, Esther, a beautiful Jewish girl. Chapter 2, verse 7 tells us that her Jewish name was Hadassah, which means myrtle. A Persian name was Esther, which means star. It seems like that her parents were among the exiles who did not return to Jerusalem, even though the Persian king had allowed them to do so. There are many reasons why people might not go back to their original homeland. One was the distance. It was 900 miles from Persia to Jerusalem. And it was a very dangerous and long trip. Plus it took financial resources to go. There were a number of reasons why Jewish people stayed in Persia. At some point in her life, Esther was orphaned. Life often deals people a cruel hand. And have you ever noticed that some people are bitter the rest of their life about the hand they are dealt, and other people somehow seem to adjust and rise above it? Esther will rise above it and become a blessing to others. She's so courageous, and there's so many times in this story where she has to make a call, to choose, to step up and choose what she will do. She'll grow up to be a courageous lady, the queen. Remember that she's a Jew as we tell this story, but the king does not know that. The fourth character in this story is her uncle. One translation calls him her cousin, Mordecai. His name means little man, but it's not a reference to his stature or his lack of height, but rather a reference to his humility. He'll raise Esther. That's noble. And his influence on her is huge. Finally, in chapter 3, we'll be introduced to the villain in this story. An arrogant, self-centered, greedy, racist Persian named Haman, whom chapter 8, verse 1 calls the enemy of God's people. Again, the major participants of this story cannot see God at work, and they cannot see God using any one of them. But make no mistake about it, God is at work. So here's the story. I'll try to do it quickly. Chapter 1, verse 3 says that in the third year of this Persian king's reign, he throws a party for 180 straight days to show off his vast wealth. Now you just think about that. He throws a 6-month continual party. 6 months. And all of his servants, from the least to the greatest, are invited, and they got everything they want to eat for 6 months and everything they want to drink for 6 months. It's a continual party for half a year. There may be some teenagers who have been on one, but most people don't get to do that. A half year continual party. And this is the leaders of the kingdom, and all of his servants. Just think about it for a moment. Not only have they partied, but they've neglected their kingdom for 6 months. They've neglected their families for 6 months. They've neglected their children for 6 months. History says that it was not uncommon among the Persians to have a big blowout like this before they would go into battle. And history says that this one preceded the battle that they will have against their neighboring country, Greece. History also says they end up with a crushing defeat, which is not surprising, by the way, if you've been on a 6-month party or drunk and then go into battle. It's not surprising you're not really prepared. After the 6 months are over, the king decides we need to party another week. And so that's what they do. Verse 10 says, when the king was high in spirits from the wine, he commands Queen Vashti to come show off her beauty to the men who served him. It's all about stroking his huge ego. To her credit, she refuses to be an object to be goggled by a bunch of drunken men. I hope every young girl and every lady in here will listen closely. Do not compromise your values and your integrity for the immediate shallow gratification of some boy or man who only has one thing on their brain. To Vashti's eternal credit, she would not be the object of someone's lustful passions, and that includes her husband. She draws her boundaries. She makes her stand. The king's furious because nobody tells him no. He always gets what he wants. He calls his advisors in, and it's amazing when you read through this story that he can never make a call on his own. He calls his advisors in and he asks for their advice. What should we do? And these mealy-mouthed advisors say, you better make an example of her or we're going to catch it when we get home. They say we're going to be men who women will stand up to if you don't do something. And so, he does. She's thrown out of the kingdom and out of his harem. And she'll suffer the consequences. But listen closely, she can go to her bed at night with her integrity. And she can sleep at peace at night, knowing who she is and what she stands for. Regardless of what your past has been, regardless of where you are today, you can start right now and be Queen Vashti. Chapter 2 begins with the fact that the king's anger has now subsided. And his advisors now propose that there be a beauty contest in Persia. Whoever wins will be in his harem and eventually will replace Queen Vashti and become the new queen. Verse 7 says Esther was lovely in form and features. That's a nice way of saying she was a knockout. She was gorgeous, drop dead gorgeous. But I love what the author of the book Esther, a woman of strength and integrity, had to say. He pointed out that not only was she beautiful physically, but he mentioned 6 beautiful qualities and attributes that she had in addition to her stunning elegance. Listen to what he said. He said she also had a grace-filled presence about her, a charm and a beauty that comes inwardly as well as outwardly. Secondly, he had said she had wisdom, a wonderful brain to go with her looks, and a wonderful personality as well. Thirdly, she was kind and humble. Fourthly, she had a teachable spirit. And fifthly, he said she had an unselfish modesty about her. She was authentic and real. She's the real deal. There's nothing fake about her at all. The last sentence of verse 15 says Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. And verse 17 says that the king was attracted to her more than any of the other women. And therefore she's crowned the winner and becomes the new queen of Persia. You mean to tell me, preacher, that God can work in something as seemingly insignificant as a beauty pageant? You just decide. That's what this book is saying, even when we don't see. Chapter 2 ends with Mordecai finding out about the assassination plot against the king. He tells Esther, who reports it to the king. And those who plotted that assassination were apprehended and killed. The last sentence of the chapter said, all this was recorded in the annals of the presence of the king. Let it sink in. We'll come back to it in just a moment. In chapter 3, we're introduced to the villain. He's Haman, that evil man who's promoted to the prime minister, to the seat of honor. The Bible says in verse 1 that he was an Agagite. Very quickly, do you remember who Agag was way back in that time when Saul was told to go utterly destroy the Amalekites because they were enemies of God's people? They were the people who first attacked Israel in Exodus 17 after they had crossed the Red Sea on their way to the Promised Land. They were barbaric people. God wanted them eliminated so His people could live in a land of peace. Saul didn't do that, brought back King Agag. These are his descendants here. It's fascinating. This is a man who lived a double life. He appeared to the king to be a man he could trust, but he was not at all. He was infuriated one day when he comes through the kingdom and Mordecai the Jew wouldn't bow down to him. It sets in motion the things that are in the rest of this book. He persuades the king to sign a non-revocable genocide, a decree to kill and eliminate all Jews living in Persia. Basically, he says this: they're of no profit to you, my king, and if you'll just eliminate them, I'll pay you. I'll pay you 10,000 shekels or talents of silver. One estimate is $10 million. Well, where would a guy get $10 million? Most people believe that when this whole group of people would be killed in a massive amount, he'd just go in to all their homes, plunder everything, and bring it to the coffers of the king. When Mordecai finds out about it, it brings us to the story that you are familiar with, which is our text today. Let's read. He sends words to Esther. And when Esther sends word back to him what I need to do, Esther's words are reported to Mordecai. He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're the king's house, you alone and all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but what you have come to the royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days or nights. And I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. That is such a faith-filled perspective. Mordecai basically sends this word to Esther. Don't think that you are exempt from this edict. Don't think for one moment that because you're in the palace, it does not apply to you. You'll die too. If you don't step up, our entire family, all of our people will perish. If you don't step up, did you notice the line that hit me fresh this week? God will bring good out of it, and He's going to bring deliverance in it some way. He's going to work some way. If you don't choose to cooperate with Him, He's going to work through somebody else. He's going to work. But who knows but what He might be calling you. He might be wanting to work through you. Wow. I always get chill bumps every time I think of this passage and think of the words in the contemporary Christian songwriter Wayne Watson, who wrote his song based on this verse. It goes like this: now. All I have is now, to be faithful, to be holy, and to shine. Lighting up the darkness right now, I have no choice but to voice the truth to the nations. Because there's a generation that's looking for God for such a time as this. I've been placed upon this earth to hear the voice of God and do His will, whatever it is. For such a time as this, for now and all the days He gives, I am here, I am here, I am His. For such a time as this. And you, do you wonder why? Seems like the grass is greener under everybody else's sky, but right here for this time and place, you can live a mirror of His mercy, a foreign image of His grace for such a time as this. I was placed upon this earth to hear the voice of God and do His will, whatever it is. For such a time as this, for now and all the days He gives, I'm here, I am here, I am His, for such a time as this. Can't change what's happened till now, but can change what will be by living in holiness that the world will see. The world will see Jesus. We're here for such a time as this. So try to picture the scene. That if she walks in uninvited and He's not receptive to her being in His presence, she dies. Try to picture the scene. Chapter 5 verse 1 says, on the third day. Have you ever noticed that powerful things happen on the third day? Jonah's in the belly of that fish on the third day. She asked her people to fast what? For 3 days. Jesus is in the tomb for how many days? 3 days. On the third day, Esther puts on her royal robes and stands in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. Can you picture her standing there, beautiful, regal, but a twinge of anxiousness in her heart pounding. She opens the door and walks in. The Bible says there He is sitting on His throne on the other side. He sees her in all of her royal beauty. He's an idiot if he doesn't raise a scepter, isn't he? I mean, he's an idiot. And he does. And he asks what she has on her mind. And using a soft edge, she doesn't tell him. Women are brilliant a lot of times like that. And she says, I want to invite you and Haman to a dinner I've prepared. He said to his guards, go call Haman. Let's bring him to the dinner if that's what you want. I'm ready to eat. And they do. And they have a great time. She doesn't say anything that night. When the dinner is ended, he says, you sure you don't have anything else on your mind? She says, how about dinner tomorrow night? He said, I'll be there. Haman leaves the dinner party. He's feeling good about his private dinner with the king and queen. Goes out, sees Mordecai. Everybody bows down, but Mordecai is furious. Goes back home, tells his wife and friends what's happened. Throws a party in his own honor. Again, they're the partying bunch of people, aren't they? Wants to show off his wealth, and then he finally tells his wife what's on his mind. That there's one person in the kingdom won't bow down. She says, build some gallows 75 feet high. You can get the king to do anything, have him sign a law to kill Mordecai. God's at work in chapter 6. I'll do this very quickly. The king cannot sleep. Who would ever thought that God, the God who made heaven and earth, would work in somebody's insomnia? But He does. The king cannot sleep. He calls for his servants to bring him the history books. That'll put you to sleep, won't it? The chronicles of what happened every day. I don't need anybody telling me this joke. I'll do this in about 2 minutes. But one time I got a phone call from a friend in Georgia who said, I can't sleep. I just thought you might preach a little bit. I knew that'd put me out. When they're reading the chronicles, the history of the record, he finds out what Mordecai had done about the assassination plot. And he looked and he said to his guys, have we ever done anything to honor this man? I mean, how do you repay somebody who you owe your very life to? And hello, do we owe our life to anybody? The men we've honored today in Jesus Christ, don't we? And he calls Haman in. He says, what do we do for somebody you owe your life to? That I like to honor. Haman thinks it's him. He says, have a parade. Put him on a colt. Give him the best robes. And he says, okay, I want to honor Haman. How about you carrying it out? And this guy is absolutely stunned as he walks through the streets, pulling this horse with Mordecai riding it. He's absolutely furious. The bottom line is this. They have that dinner, that second dinner. Esther tells him what Haman has done, and the king orders Haman's death on those gallows, but you still have the edict to deal with, unrevocable. So what happens? How did God work in an unrevocable law? The king passes another one, signs it, and basically says this: when we come to kill you, you can defend yourself. And when that day came, a lot of the Persians joined forces with the Jews against their own people. Isn't that amazing how God works? Amazing for such a time as this. But make no mistake about it, God is at work. And the point of our lesson this morning is this: whatever you brought up in the first of this lesson, whatever God has brought you to, make no mistake about it, He will bring you through. He will bring you through. The last chapter is about the 2-day festival that the Jews still commemorate to this day. The Feast of Purim, where on the first day all the families retell this story I just told you. And it's an interactive event where the kids cheer for the heroes and boo the villains. And the second day, guess what they do? If anybody misses this, you weren't listening. They have a big party. But they relive the story. They relive the story that God is at work. Look, your way can be dim, and you may not see light at the end of the tunnel for the while. But the Lord's holding our hand, and God is at work. And we encourage you this morning, if you need that reassurance that God's with you and that He's working and that Jesus is holding your hand, who knows but what you've come today here to the kingdom for such a time as this. And if you need Him, would you come as together we stand and sing?